The Pro Show is brought to you by Rockin' Media and our proprietary Flash HDR photo process, providing you with the best, most realistic photos of your property. See the difference at rockinmedia.com. Hi, and welcome to the Pro Show. I'm Rick Machle. On this show, we have our two real estate experts who are pros. One is a professional mortgage broker. The other is a professional mortgage broker and a real estate broker. So this is going to be an interesting discussion about strategy in this current listing season. That's next on the Pro Show. On this All Mortgage Pro Show, we are talking with Nancy Alexander and Kristen Buono, and Kristen is with KB Real Estate and Lending. Hi, Kristen.
Hello, hello.
She does both real estate. She's a broker as well as a mortgage broker. And of course, you all recognize Nancy Alexander from Smart Mortgage Services. Hi, Nancy.
Hi, Rick.
She's here in Evergreen, and Kristen is in California. And so we've got a little bit of geographic diversity. And today we want to talk about the spring market and market strategies in this market. And of course, we have to keep in mind that the market is different where you live. And since this is a national podcast, you may be in a market that's still really hot. You may be in another market that isn't quite as hot. So we're going to try and kind of go down the middle on that, based on the fact that we're trying to give people different strategies. So, Nancy, where do we want to start out on this discussion?
You know, Kristen and I have been talking, and you and I have been talking as well, because it is the spring market, right? And that's still a market that a lot of people jump into. They do wait for that April, May, June, etc. So Kristen and I were talking earlier about sellers right now and what is it that sellers can expect. And with Kristen having the dual, which, you know, being both the realtor and of course the lender, really gives her such a different perspective. We have such different conversations, Kristen, than what I have with my other realtors, as you and I have talked about, right? So I want to jump on this real quick because there's tools that buyers can use, but they affect seller, right? So let's start with, we got a purchase price of $700,000. Okay, it's irrelevant what we're buying, single family residence, condo, whatever. Right, but we got $700,000 and a buyer comes to you. You're listing it, Kristen. Okay. So a buyer is coming to your seller and the buyer offers $710,000. Says, oh, $10,000 over, right? Your purchase price where you listed it at. Yep. And however, the buyer is asking for a temporary 2-1 buy down, right? They want to use a tool because of the market. And in turn, they're asking for a seller credit of, let's say, $15,000. So essentially, your seller is what? Netting less? Or how are you negotiating this? How are you talking to your seller?
Basically, we're basically telling the seller, hey, we have this offer. We're at 7. They offered 710. They want 15 back. So it's 5,000 less in his proceeds. So as we discussed, you know, I think I always ask this conversation with the seller, what's your number? What's your number? Where do you want to land? We talk about the net sheet at the very beginning.
When you say what's your number, in other words, what do you want to walk away with?
Yes.
What's your net dollars, right?
Exactly. And are you, and has it been 2 weeks on the market? Has it been 1 day on the market? Has it been 30 days on the market? Has it been 90 days on the market? And if that number has been 700,000 for 90 days, then, you know, now he's made 3 mortgage payments if there's a mortgage on the property. So now the conversation just turns to, are you good with taking $5,000 less? Do we want to hold out for that other $5,000? And
what happens if you came back and you said, okay, let's counter this offer?
Yeah.
And we'll give you the 10,000. You want to go the 710. We'll give you the 10,000, which still nets us at our original purchase price of 700,000. But problem is that buyer has a certain dollar amount that buyer has to feed that 2-1 buy down bucket.
Correct.
Right? And so if you counter back, in fact, let's back up for a minute. because let's say I'm the buyer and I overbid, right?
Okay.
Are you going to come back at me with an appraisal gap?
Possibly, depending on the market, really
So
depending
what is
on
an
the market.
appraisal gap?
Yeah, what is that?
So basically what happens is, and I'll pick up the phone and have a conversation with the buyer's agent as well. I'll look at proof of funds. I get proof of funds. I don't care what the transaction is. If it's, 5% down, 3% down, whatever it is, if it's gift funds, whatever it is, we do get proof of funds. So we do have the conversation with the buyer's agent as well. And hopefully the buyer's agent has done their job and,
Right.
and gotten those things as well. But basically, you're telling the buyer, hey, you know what, we're going to accept this offer. But if the appraisal doesn't come in, you're still going to pay this price and you're going to make up the difference. That's the gap.
That's the appraisal gap that you're then pushing back to the buyer and saying, sure, we'll take your 710, but Mr. Buyer, you're going to sign an appraisal waiver again,
Correct.
saying we're responsible for up to purchase price, in this case of 700,000.
Correct.
Right?
Yes.
If the appraise is at 695, do I, as the buyer, can I come back and say, okay, well, not only did it not appraise at my 710 that I offered you, but it appraised 5,000 under what your purchase price is. Does that negate my appraisal gap?
I don't know. No, not necessarily. No, not at all. I mean, it's again, it's another conversation. Every transaction is different. And
Right.
I'm a big, Nancy knows this. I'm a big, full transparency. Let's all get on the phone and talk and let's see what's going to make sense. If the seller can hang out for another 30, 90 days and wait for another offer and say, a hard no, this is my price, then they may have to go find another buyer. If the buyer is so in love with this property, they'll do anything they can to get this property and they have the money, then they're going to pay for it. Then they'll come up with the cash, the difference. But no, it's all, to your point, it is a conversation, it's a negotiation, and we all go back and have that conversation, buyer agent, selling agent, buyers, sellers, everybody's on the same page to figure out what's going to make the most sense for that transaction for everybody, because everybody wants to win at the end of the day.
Right. I was going to say, some of the best advice I was given years ago was if a buyer wants to buy and a seller wants to sell, your job as the realtor, right, is to pull that transaction together and make it a win-win. No question.
Correct.
No question.
Correct.
So go back to the buy down for a minute. Are you opposed when a buyer brings in or asking for a seller credit, whether it's for a temporary buy down, whether it's for permanent points, whatever it may be?
You know what, Nancy, depending, and again, this is, globally we're speaking, but depending on your market, I'll go in with the seller day one and say, look, and I'll look at the value because everybody knows that their house is worth, 10 times what the comparables are sometimes. Well, mine's the nicest on the block, and I did this to my shower and I did that to my kitchen, So, just having that conversation. When I go into the seller, I'll look at the value from the appraiser standpoint, just so we can shape the expectation to the seller. Hey, I get it. You think your house is worth 700,000. Numbers don't lie. These are the comparables in the area. The appraiser will look at, XYZ. Let's budget in, with the recent market, let's budget in some closing costs. This is where your net will probably be if we list this.
So really what you're to do, or what you're doing, is you're defending, right? You're defending your purchase price.
I'm
saying if it's not a dartboard approach, in other words.
I won't do
seller says, I want 750, and you say, look, comps are here at 700,000, and here's the proof, and this is what I can defend to an appraiser if, in fact, an appraisal comes in play, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
So, all right.
It's more about expectation. It's really about expectation. And hey, Mr. Seller, your new job is starting in 3 months out of state, and we can play the market. If you want to play the market, we can put it out.
But again, Kristen, you have a different perspective because you run because you run the numbers. And
I do.
So you're bringing in right now, which I love, you're bringing in an income element, right? But really on the buyer side, that it's like, okay, Mr. Seller, you're going to be a buyer, right? And so in turn, how does the choice you make on the sales side with whatever contract you're bringing, right? You're receiving, I should say, from buyers.
Sure.
You got to look globally at what's the picture, where is it you're headed to, how soon do you want to go, etc.
Right. And I'm fine throwing out that price out there, Nancy. I mean, okay, let's put it out there at 750. Let's see what kind of activity we get. And in the meantime, these are all the marketing strategies.
But you're also setting those expectations, I would assume, to say, if we're going to take your dartboard approach, almost, Mr. Seller, then we're only going to hold that approach for so long. Because
Correct.
Again, you start dropping price. And another good piece of advice I was told by a broker was, you start dropping price and the market starts chasing your price drops.
Right, exactly.
They drop 10,000, they're dropping 5,000 more. But let's go back the other way in the conversation.
Yeah.
Let's go back that, are you in a position right now in your market that you're seeing multiple bids?
No.
Okay. Are you seeing over than asking price, other than in the situation we started with of this, in this case, 10,000 over our $700,000 purchase price?
No.
Okay. In our market, we are. In the Denver market, we're starting to, and it's in pockets. Like Rick knows probably better than anybody, is that it's all about location, right? Because he goes out and films all of these locations, and so you can have this beautiful home in a pocket that anyway, you're not gonna get those multiple offers. But we are seeing it here a little more and more, and I am seeing people going in over asking price when there's no competition.
Yeah.
I'm like, whoa, wait a minute.
Not a fan.
Exactly. If you go back to real estate being strategy and negotiation, right? A little more strategy, a little more negotiation. Okay, now we're at the closing table. Then why are you coming in with that strategy? So I think I love your approach, Kristen, as far as transparency. What is it that we're doing? What are we trying to achieve? What are the overall goals of this transaction for seller, if you're representing seller, but you get to represent buyer as well.
Right.
Right. Yeah. And so then you're putting on your other hat. I wonder if you ever really take off either.
I've tried to take it off. However, I just think they're so important to know both. The gentleman I have right now, I sold him a condo, young kid down in San Diego. He's in the military. He's exiting the military this year. He's moving back to Denver. So I'm not licensed in Colorado. So you'll be meeting him probably this fall to help him
Good.
use his VA, benefit, because he's exiting the military. He's on kind of a timeline. So we were really realistic. He's owned it for 2.5 years. There's a little bit, if you do your 3 to 4% year over year national average equity, we're a little skinny.
Wait a minute, back up for a second.
Sorry, I'm backing. Yeah.
That's your rate of return on your investment, right? Is what you're talking about.
So it sounds like your market is probably higher.
Our market is what, Rick? 5 to 7?
I think I heard we're not quite that much. We're about 2 to 3 still in this market.
Really?
Yeah, in most of the market, because we have parts of the market that are down, and then there are other parts that are up just a little bit, and others that are totally flat. But it's all specific to the neighborhoods. And and I am hearing multiple offers on lots of them in the first weekend, and then others that have been on the market since June of last year, and they're good properties. Wow. But so it's all pocketed. It's not the 2022 where everything was selling. But Nancy, I just wanted to go down a little bit of a rabbit hole with, relative to the appraisal gap and defining that and how that works. And you guys maybe have a discussion about that, because in our scenario with 700,000, and it appraises 700, but I want 720, but I'll do 15, I want 15 back in lending. How does that work?
Well, it's a great question, because the problem is with an appraisal gap, or for buyer, the risk they take, lender's only going to lend based on purchase price or appraised value, whichever is less. So there's the key, right? It's whichever is less. So if we go back to our scenario and we say buyer goes in with 710, Kristen prices it at 700, and she says, yes, we'll take the contract, but we want an appraisal gap. Let's say it appraises at 705. Okay, so buyer now has to pay 5,000 out of pocket to get to that 710 contract price that they agreed upon, irrespective of what they're doing with the overage of money, right?
Okay.
Whatever tool they're using on the lending side is irrespective of that. So, so it has to appraise, and what Kristen's doing by asking for an appraisal gap is she's protecting her seller.
So that doesn't come off the market for 30 days just to get to finding out that it doesn't appraise. They don't have the extra $5,000,
Right.
And now your contract falls out, right, Kristen?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so you're trying to protect your seller by having that appraisal gap, but of course that thing comes back to the proof of funds, because if they don't have the $5,000 to make up the difference, right, and still be able to qualify and get their mortgage and everything else, then it's not a real contract, because you're just hoping at that point from the seller side that it appraises at 710.
As they
Right.
say, hope is never a good business strategy. Right?
Yeah. Hope isn't.
But it goes back to their time frame.
Right.
Maybe the home's been on the market for X amount of days, and we've got to go start the new job, or we've got to go close on the new build that the builder is waiting for them to close on, whatever that situation is. And they might, maybe the seller would suck up the $5,000. It just,
right.
Every transaction is different.
Right.
Right. And that's a very good point. Just because you have it in there, the appraisal gap, you're still having negotiations once the appraisal has come in. And the sweetest scenario, which we haven't even talked about, you guys, is if that buyer is coming in, right, Kristen, they still ask for the 10,000 over. We're going to stay with that scenario, but they come in and they're coming in with 25% down. And say you really did price that thing right, and you run AUS, right, automated underwriting system, and or Fannie or Freddie gives an appraisal waiver. All of a sudden, poof, that conversation is gone. The appraisal gap becomes irrelevant.
Right.
You've got the appraisal waiver at the 710 because that's what the lender's going to run, right? Yep. You're, again, in this scenario, you're representing seller as the realtor.
Yep.
I'm doing the lending, and I call you and say, you know what, we're going to take appraisal off the table because we've gotten an appraisal waiver through our automated underwriting findings, and let's move forward. You got to deal with inspection, and otherwise we're getting borrower to the closing table, right?
To the closing table, absolutely, yeah.
Kristen?
Absolutely. It does now. Now I'm going to pretend I'm the buyer's agent, because it does give a little more juice. On the buyer side, now I'm going to do my inspection, and you know what? I found some stuff, Mr. Seller, and in the spirit of time, because we want to close this, don't fix it, but you know what? I want X amount of dollars closing cost credit, or whatever it might be in lieu,
Right.
We never say in lieu of repair.
In other words,
but it does give the buyer a little more juice.
Well, but again, you go back to strategy.
Mm-hmm.
So if, as we started this, we said real estate is strategy, negotiation. Yep. So first they're going to sit with you and say, where do I list this and why do I list it at this? Where do I buy and why do I buy at this, right? Everybody's still looking at comps, whether you're on the buy side or the sales side.
Or the sell side, yep.
Right? And then it's, okay, here's our strategy. Now let's put it in negotiation, i.e. a contract. Mm-hmm. Now let's see if that contract's accepted or if it's countered, right? Now you finally get to where you have an accepted contract, if you do have a counter in there. Now you've got inspection, right? It's first thing out of the gate.
Right.
inspection. But again, do we know whether that appraisal waiver is in play rather than appraisal gap? Well, sure we do, because the lender has already ran that through the automated underwriting system, right? I mean, if they're
You would, because you and I would, because we're the good brokers out there who will do their job. Some depending on when the timing is, but yes, you are correct.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Let's go back to tools that buyers can use.
Yeah.
For a minute. And in tools that buyers can use in this example. So again, we stay at 700. We went in at 710. They got a $10,000 overage, and that's a seller credit. They're getting that back as a seller credit. What can they do with that money, right?
Right.
So, right. You're telling seller, yes, you're giving the credit back. Buyer is saying, okay, I want to look at a 2-1 buy down, temporary 2-1 buy down, should always throw that in there, versus or in comparison to buying discount points. Right.
Or I'm not going to use it for any discount or a 2-1 buy down. I'm just going to take whatever rates out there, and I'm going to keep my cash, even though I've got plenty of money.
Right. I'm
going to live in this house for a year or 2 years, but that could bode to the 2-1 buy down anyway. However, that's a whole, I'm going to just take.
In other words, you're taking the 10 grand just to apply to closing costs.
Closing costs.
Okay.
Correct.
No, you're spot on.
Recurring, non-recurring, and both, closing cost period. So I want to keep my money. I don't want to give the lender any money. I'm just gonna, get it. Right. Is less out of my pocket.
So it always comes back to, and I think it's what I love so much about this, and what's kept me in the game for what feels like a very long time, is that every story is different.
Correct.
Every situation is different, and it really is fun to start off with that client to say, okay, what's the goal here?
Yeah.
Where are we going? What are we trying to achieve? Like you've been saying, you keep referring to what's the timeline here, be it seller, be it buyer. When do you want to be in? When do you want to be out?
Right. Exactly. Right. I always joke, we're all a Lifetime made for TV movie. And we all have a story to tell, and we all have a puzzle that we're putting together for everyone, and putting those pieces of the puzzle together. That's the fun. I mean, that's the, I think you're right.
It is the fun. It's like going into that 2-1 buy down. I mean, that's all about strategy.
Yep. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Kristen, are you doing appraisals on every listing before you go on the market, or are you just doing comps, pulling comps, so approximately how much it should sell for today? Yeah. We always, that's the other strategy that makes it a more complex too, because if the market's changing a lot, either up or down, but how do you handle that?
Yeah. Exactly. That's a great question, Rick. I do look at it from the appraiser standpoint. I don't really recommend sellers to pay for an appraiser up front, because all the data is at my disposal. I used to go back, 4 to 5 months on comps, because the market is so ever changing. I'll go in. I have one right now I'm doing, and I'm only going in about 90 days out. And I'll go, with appraisers, you can go 400 square feet higher to 400 square feet lower. Mm-hmm. And if you can get it within a mile, that's great. But then if there's nothing there, you're going to have to go 1.5 miles or 2 miles.
You're talking a mile radius from the property.
Or
1.5 mile radius. And again, if you say radius, right, it's a big area.
It is a big area. And so, yes, I don't call an appraiser. I think my numbers are pretty spot on. Now, I'll do the exact same thing. I'm doing it with a buyer right now. Because I think the seller and the seller's agent are high. Sorry, because they're playing the dartboard. They're playing the dartboard, and
their price is high. Their price is high, not necessarily that they're smoking something.
I don't know. I
Okay.
don't know.
There you
No,
go.
and I
No
no
comment.
judgment.
No judgment. No judgment. Just.
But I'm looking at the past history of the listing. It was on the market last fall for 90 days at 1.6. They took it off the market. It's now back on the market. We're going on 60 days at 1.55. They just lowered it to
So
1.
what are you doing though? Are you going in and getting comps for that buyer
I'm going
and
in.
saying,
Yep.
this supports our 1.3 offer, or
Yes.
right, whatever your offer is?
Correct. And not to school the listing agent. I know the listing agent, but I'm like, okay, seriously? Like, did you look at the comps?
Because it's not going to appraise anyway. So either you have a cash buyer,
Exactly,
or you're toast anyway.
Exactly. And my buyer happens to be cash.
Okay.
So that plays a little, in their favor. And oh, by the way, in California, we got funky taxes. And, just again, it's just getting all that information and providing it to the seller, because again, they're going to be a buyer and they need to know what this stuff looks like too. So I usually just pull numbers myself is the short answer.
But when you say your listing's been on the market for 90 days, and so you're on the listing side, and you comped it when you put it on the market, and maybe you're in a market where it's falling. What happens then? But you go under contract in 45 days, but it doesn't, you don't get all your numbers done for another 30 and it's gone down. So in our scenario, instead of 700, it now appraises at 680. Now what?
To Nancy's point, every transaction is different and every strategy is different. So in a case like that, if we are in a declining market, educate the seller. If they don't know it, again, you show the numbers. But then you get creative. And to Nancy's point, you do, maybe you throw out some, permanent, you do the 2-1 buy down, or you do the, you budget that into the seller's, net sheet, or you do an agent credit. Sometimes agents are likely to show the property if there's maybe a little more bonus to the agent. There's some agents out there that, that's the driver to get the showing. Maybe everyone's there. Every transaction is going to be different.
And I've heard multiple times where, unfortunately, and this is probably your discussion you have with your homeowners as well, is what you need may not be what it's worth. In which case, in our scenario, if I need 700 and I can't come to the closing table with 20 grand because the most it's going to appraise for is 680 and that's all I'm going to get, the house is worth 680, right? At that point?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well,
so
the house is worth what the buyer's willing.
What the buyer's going to pay. Yes.
Right. But if the buyer isn't willing to go, any more than 680, and it won't appraise for more than 680, and they can't, and you don't have that gap, or you maybe had a $5,000 or $10,000 appraisal gap, and now it's a $30,000 appraisal gap, right? Isn't that the way it works?
No, because you're going in the wrong direction, though, Rick. Because you're not having an appraisal gap if it's dropping below, right? You're only having an appraisal gap if you're protecting the seller's dollars.
Oh, okay.
Buyer came in over. There's an overage. If the appraisal comes in lower, like you're painting, and you actually have a $700,000 purchase price and the appraisal comes in at 680, the first thing you'd want to do is you'd want to do a reconsideration of value.
Okay.
You because again, Kristen
which is
saying,
which is that?
Well, yeah, a reconsideration of value is saying, I disagree with the appraiser.
Okay.
And Kristen's saying, look, I've got 3 comps that are not on your appraisal that better support this property. Again, if it doesn't look right, smell right, feel right, it's not right. So question it, whether it's in your real estate transaction or whether it's in your job interview or wherever it is in life, right? And so again, if it comes in at 680 and Kristen feels solid on her, I would assume, on your comparables, right? Then you're going to defend it. Now, if you defend it and the lender looks at the reconsideration of value and agrees with the reconsideration of value, now the lender puts out the money for the second appraisal. Okay, you can't just go say, I didn't like the appraisal, whether you're the seller or whether you're the buyer. It doesn't matter what role you're playing in this. There's some real defined rules around appraisals.
You can't shop appraisers until you find one that gives you the right note.
Exactly.
That's part of the Dodd-Frank stuff from
that was so 2007.
That was so 2002,
2005 or 2004.
Exactly.
Yeah,
so
that's when it was good, But yes, no, there's.
But if they come back, but if the lender comes back and agrees with the first appraisal, in our case, the 680.
Then you go back, as Kristen and I are talking, then you go back and open up the negotiation back up to say, okay, folks, we've got a 680 appraisal, we've got a $700,000 purchase price. Do you want to meet in the middle?
Okay.
Yeah. Or hey, will the seller, Mr. Seller, will take that value, but we won't participate in any more closing cost credits.
Okay.
There you go.
So, again, it's just a conversation.
Right.
Yeah.
Or everybody walks away and put it back on the market, hoping you, because if your seller needs 700, they're not going to come in the middle because they need it.
But this is just it, Rick. What is the need versus the want?
Yeah.
Well, the need may be that their loan balance is 700, and after closing costs and everything else,
that would be 100% financing. Nobody sits at 100% financing.
Sorry, I meant plus closing costs, plus real estate agent fees and everything else. There are scenarios right now where they've only maybe got 3% in they've been in their home for a couple of years. They've got 3%. Or maybe they have negative equity, depending on what part of the market, and they're closing. They're trying to sell, and by the time you add in closing costs plus agent, real estate fees, it's more than what they owe on the house right now.
Well, and if that's the case again, then that's where you go back and you have to have that conversation with that seller that I'm sure Kristen is having, of saying, what's the reality here? Because she's setting that. I mean, Kristen, you and I have talked about it so much. You're setting up that scenario before the house ever goes on the market, that look, if you're this skinny, right? If you're this skinny on your dollars and you can't waver here by 5,000 or even 10,000 in the market and in negotiations, then maybe now is not the time for you to put your house on the market, and maybe it would be better to put it into the rental market and to become the landlord than what it is to become
hang tight. Do we see that value improve?
So is that a discussion you would have, Kristen?
Absolutely. I would have two discussions. Remember, going back to what you were saying about if the appraisal is the appraisal, depending on the kind of financing, that appraisal will stay with the property.
Okay, right.
Meaning, if it's a conventional loan, it typically won't, depending on how the appraiser gets it posted to Fannie, whatever that is. But if it's a government finance transaction, and that's the same conversation with the seller. Hey, by the way, if we accept this VA or FHA offer, and if the appraised value does not come in, and if you don't have enough room to take that lower offer, and if the buyer doesn't have the money to make up the appraisal gap, and if we have to remarket the property, we're limiting our buyer pool to conventional, because that government offer.
Because why? But why though, Kristen? The appraisal sticks with the property for 6 months.
With the property, correct.
For 6 months. So if that buyer is an FHA buyer, and that appraisal, we go to Rick's scenario, came in at 680, right? Yeah. And again, that buyer's only putting 3.5% down. They don't have any money to fill that $20,000 gap of 700,000 to 680, right? And so they're bummed. The seller, in Rick's case, isn't dropping, whether it's a want or a need. So you got a transaction which is done. right? Which you say, okay, we're not getting to the closing table on this transaction. So it is all of the pieces, right?
Going back to the puzzle.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, I love it.
But you're doing, instead of necessarily doing an appraisal, you're just doing a CMA, competitive market analysis. And depending on where you live, Nancy was, I think, saying that, 1 month or 1 mile radius is pretty big, but where I live, it's nothing. We might have 4 houses that have sold in that, and none of them are comps. So are you then expanding out, and do the appraisals expand out if you've got a low density area, or how does that work? Or is it case by case, Kristen?
It does. I mean, it does, because again, it's part of the puzzle to say, are you selling? And Kristen, you're familiar with Highlands Ranch. We'll use it as an example, right? You got 76,000 homes or whatever. So, your mile radius treats you very, very well. Rick, as you're saying, Evergreen, Conifer, Colorado, not only do you have uniqueness in property, right? You don't have every 4th house looking the same or the same floor plan, right? But you also have this person has 60 acres and that person has 35 acres and this person has 10 acres and etc. So yes, you can go out on your appraisals. You can go to a 5-mile radius. You can go to a 25-mile radius. But the problem is that the appraiser has to substantiate why they did that to the underwriter.
That's basically telling that everything's that they are apples to apples.
Well, sure. It's how much does the appraiser, how much more does the appraiser put in to substantiate the value that they are submitting on this particular property?
And are there other strategies that if I'm looking to sell or buy that I should be considering relative to rates? And do you just automatically go to market with, Kristen, with we're paying a seller concession of $10,000 or $15,000 in our scenario here, or is that something that you wait for the buyer to come to you with?
The short answer, it depends. Every transaction.
Of course, yes.
However, for my condo in San Diego example, it's a VA buyer. It's
right.
It's a lot of
military,
active duty military. Colorado Springs is probably
same way.
similar. So it would be in our best interest, Mr. Seller, to build in this seller concession in your net sheet, what you're going to get, to open our buyer pool to market your property to as many people as we can, so we will get a strong offer right out of the gate.
And so you're putting that in the marketing materials, or how do I know as a buyer that that's out there as an option on this property?
That's a good question.
It depends.
I mean, are you putting in the public remarks, seller offering, if it's been on the market for 90 days, they might be put it in there. Okay.
Yes. If right out of the gate, no, I typically don't. Not in my market. Again, throughout the country, maybe there's agents who, you don't have that, you don't have that luxury of time perhaps, or they have to sell because of whatever reason. And maybe there's 10 other houses on the same street that are being listed, and you've got to do something to stand out on the marketing side of things. So yeah, you're throwing out there, hey, sellers willing to participate in a 2-1 buy down, seller to credit buyer's agent X amount of dollars if closed by X date. There's different little things you can.
I was going to say, and isn't there also, Kristen, isn't it dependent, because I hear a lot of agents around here that there's certain things you can say and certain things you can't say in your MLS,
Correct.
Your multiple listing service, right? As you're listing that property, and especially with the new rules that came out and went into effect last year, and so again, wouldn't you go back and say it's about communication, about you talking to the buyer? If you're representing the seller, In this case, we've been saying your condo in San Diego, right?
Yes.
You're representing the seller. And so in turn, you're talking to each buyer's agent that's calling up and saying, hey, I've got a buyer that's interested. We saw the property yesterday. We want to ask a few questions. What is it that the seller is really focusing on? We're thinking about writing an offer. You're going to go into that dialogue and feel out that conversation.
Yeah.
Because again, you're representing your seller.
And it does set up
representing the buyer.
Exactly. And it sets up the next 30 to 45 days of our lives. If you can have that conversation, be clear, transparent, because to your point, Rick, you don't want to have to remarket it in 30 days. So if we can have that conversation and those expectations shaped up front, and we can, the last thing I want is to see an offer in my email going, who is this from, and why didn't they call me? Because that tells me that the next 30 days will be very, uncommunicative. We won't have that transparency, and we won't have that conversation. And it just doesn't, like Nancy said, it doesn't look good, it doesn't taste good, it doesn't feel good.
Right.
Well, and now you might be going back on the market. It's now July. Kids are heading back to school, and you may have a different buyer pool on there. So that conversation, if you're on the listing side, is obviously critical. And from the buyers, as a buyer's agent too.
I think what you're saying, Rick, is exactly right. And I think that's what's so interesting about these deals is when people get themselves wrapped around the axle, so to speak, regarding the negotiations. It's like, stay flexible, stay open, communicate, talk with your agent and talk with your lender. And this is what just came back. And how can we incorporate that in, whether it's on inspection, whether it's on appraisal, whatever it may be. But, things happen in 30 days and 45 days that maybe didn't happen at the start of the contract. So if my agent is talking to Kristen, right, and I'm the buyer, and Kristen is aware that something just took place in my world, maybe I'm changing jobs and we need to push the contract, right? We need to push closing by a week. How are we going to negotiate that, and how does that affect all parties? And so, again, I just think it's like, stay open. It's a transaction.
It is a transaction, and the ones that I hear that go south is one side puts their feet in concrete.
Yeah.
You do have those as well. Yeah.
It's just not to the benefit. As we started this conversation, if you got a buyer that wants to buy and a seller that wants to sell, then bring them together.
Right.
And it's about solutions, and isn't really everything that it's about solutions, not just real estate. You can deal with problems all day long, but what good are the problems? It's really focusing on the solutions.
And from what I hear, Kristen, a lot of the time this issue comes up because people forget it is an asset. By the time you put the sign in the yard, it's just like a bank account, and that it's a big bank account, hopefully, but it's a bank account, and it's getting people to realize it's not take the emotion of, this is my home that I put 20 years worth of sweat equity in, or I just redid the basement and I'm not going to get that money back. It's just what it is, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. He tried to, that's when he goes, it's relational or transactional, and, it is transaction. I do care, though, as your agent, Nancy cares as their lender, because, from the buyer side, biggest, purchase they're going to make. And from the seller side, it's the same thing. So just the full transparency, I think, is so important.
Make it fun.
Exactly.
Yeah, make it fun. I mean, come on, Thank God nobody died here. It's a real estate transaction.
Exactly.
It's like, we're not, again, like we've said before, we're not sending a man to the moon here. Come on. Let's
Although that's getting very easy, by the way.
I mean, sometimes that sounds easier, but really make it fun and make it be what you can make it be, but at the same time be flexible. Know that you're dealing with several parties and be flexible.
Well, this has been an awesome discussion, like the previous ones we've had with these two ladies. And of course, if you want to get a hold of them, you can get a hold of Kristen. They're in California at the number there on the screen. And she'd love to talk to you about whether you're looking to buy, sell, whether you're looking for a mortgage, or in her case, looking for a buyer's agent or a listing agent. She'd love to talk to you about that. She's kind of wearing lots of hats, which is great. And of course, you can get a hold of Nancy at the number on the screen if you're here in Colorado and want to have that discussion about either buying your next home or getting your home sold, and which way to go and what strategies, and she works a lot with the agents as well. And if you want to see more pro shows, you can go to theproshow.com. And as always, it's great having you ladies on, and look forward to seeing you again soon.